everybody. I'm Natasha Kirchek, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you.
All right, so let's get started. Professor, as you know, every week we open our show with special guests. Today we're honored to have Israeli Prize winner Professor Asa Kasher from Tel Aviv University. Professor Kasher is known for helping to create the code of conduct for the Israeli Defense Forces called the Spirit of the IDF. We visited Professor Kasher immediately after IDF soldier Elor Azaria received an 18-month sentence for manslaughter of a terrorist who was already neutralized. Now, let's hear from Professor Kasher about why this case has rocked Israeli society.
Shalom, Professor Dershowitz. I'm Asa Kasher. I'm a professor emeritus of philosophy, in particular of military ethics and other types of ethics. And I was involved in writing the first code of ethics of the IDF. I met you, Professor Dershowitz, once in the College of National Defense, in a discussion together with Major General Amos Yadlin and several other people on the ethics of fighting terrorism. And you were there and you saw the debates and you contributed to our discussion of morality, ethics, and international law. I have fond memories from your participation in that discussion. I'd like to say a few words about something that has attracted the attention of Israeli public for several weeks now. In Israel, everyone is in the IDF. IDF is us. It's not some remote them who are professional men and women in military uniform. It's us. Now, the soldier was undoubtedly acting in a very wrong way. We are very proud about having in the Code of Ethics of the IDF two values that do not appear in codes of values of other military forces, namely the sanctity of human life and what we call purity of arms, which means restraint of force. Now, restraint of force doesn't mean legal restraint of force. It means moral restraint of force. And in a nutshell, you don't kill a person if you don't have to. Now, something interesting happened. In no time, the Israeli public made very explicit the voice of protecting the soldier and defending him. In no time, the discussion turned into right versus left. This is awful. It is very wrong. We would like the military to be above politics, not to be involved in politics at all. When the commanders and the judges made a decision, namely that this was a wrong action, it didn't express their political views, it expressed their professional activities, profession of command, profession of being a judge. And I hope to see this political wave, political cloud that is now above the heads of the IDF evaporate as soon as possible for the benefit of all of us. And I will be delighted to hear your views about it, Professor Dershowitz.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Kasher. You have been a guide to my work for many, many years. I use your writings in my courses at Harvard Law School. I've used your writings and your excellent statements in lectures that I've given. You have been the leading voice of morality and ethics in how to conduct war. If every country in the world had a moral leader like you, the situation would be much improved around the world. As you know better than anybody else, armies are comprised of human beings. Human beings engage in human actions. The founder of our Constitution once said, if human beings were angels, we wouldn't need laws, we wouldn't need constitutions, we wouldn't even need professors of ethics and morality like you or people like me who have taught for years subjects about where does your morality come from, which I taught at Harvard University to undergraduates for many, many years, always using your writings, Professor Kasher, because your writings are not only ethically brilliant, but they are based on reality. They're based on not hypotheticals, the way Immanuel Kant or Jeremy Bentham based their philosophy. Yours are based on real situations that you've seen, that you've experienced in the field. And of course, the tragic case that everybody is now talking about in Israel is a perfect example of something that happened in reality. If the facts are as they were set out and as it was found by the judges, what this young man did would be a crime. He killed unnecessarily under circumstances where the captured terrorist was subdued and not a likely threat. He might argue that he thought he might have a button on him that could blow him up, but the surrounding circumstances don't support the conclusion that he was acting out of an immediate fear to his own life or the life of those around him. Having said that, it's very simple to understand how a person in his situation might react in the way that he did, but to understand is not to forgive, and it's the role of the law to judge people based on objective external standards of how a reasonable soldier would behave under the circumstances. And so my own view, not having studied the case in detail, but having read media reports on it and having been interested in it, is Israel came to just about the right conclusion. They convicted him of a serious crime of manslaughter. It was not murder in the first degree. It was manslaughter. And they gave him a punishment that reflected not only the culpability of his conduct and the need to deter others from engaging in similar conduct, but also an element of rahmanut, an element of compassion, an element of understanding that what he went through and where he was and what his mind was thinking and his heart was thinking while pounding at the same time helps explain why he did what he did. I think the conclusion of the court is that he is not an evil person, but he did an act that is criminal and must be punished as criminal. The main point to understand is that Israel put this young man on trial, despite the fact that there was a lot of opposition to him going on trial. And they sentenced him to imprisonment, which is very harsh, very, very harsh for anybody facing imprisonment. And that very, very few countries in the world would have done that under similar circumstances. In the United States, we've done that as well. And the sentences also tend to reflect the combination of deterrence and also compassion. So I agree with you, Professor Kasher, that we have to take politics out of the law, politics out of the army. People can have their own views about the Israel-Palestine conflict and how Israel deals with terrorism. But when it comes to dealing with a specific crime, the rule of law must apply. And I think on balance, the rule of law did apply. And there are those who say that this case and the punishment will give the International Criminal Court a basis for intervening in Israeli judicial system. That would be a terrible mistake. The International Criminal Court was set up to prevent genocide. It was not set up to micromanage how a democratic society deals with very complicated issues of a soldier in a situation of the kind that this soldier found himself in. So I hope that we can move on. I hope that the Israelis will stop politicizing issues like this and look to the rule of law. And Israel should be very proud of the fact that it applies the rule of law in a fair and objective manner. So thank you again, Professor Kasher, for the enormous work that you do and continue to do, and the enormous influence you've had on my own writings and thinkings and on the thinkings of so many people around the world who try to balance the need to prevent harm and danger and terrorism against the need to preserve the rule of law and the rule of morality.
All right, Professor. Now, you and Professor Kasher just discussed how this case has really tested the core values of not only the IDF, but also the entire Israeli public. And getting back to the legal side of this case, you actually mentioned this in your answer. What do you believe are the implications of the verdict, and how likely is it that this case, this case could end up bringing a larger case against Israel in the International Criminal Court?
It would be a terrible mistake, and I would stand ready to defend Israel in any court if it were put on trial based on this or other cases like this. Look, I think Israeli soldiers who are young kids, many of them just in their late teens, have to receive exceptional training, I'm sure they do, as to how to deal with circumstances like this. These occur all over the world. We've had a case in America. I represented somebody in America, a colonel who was tried for not similar conduct, but conduct of a comparable nature. What happened is a bunch of American young soldiers had been murdered by Iraqi terrorists, and then American soldiers apparently took revenge, and that had to be brought to trial. And the question was whether or not that revenge was incited by a high-ranking colonel, and in the end, the charges were dropped against the colonel. These are so difficult, such complicated matters, and to second-guess a country, a democratic country operating under the rule of law, from the comfort of The Hague would be a terrible misinterpretation of the Rome Statute. And I'm confident that anybody who cares about international criminal justice will not want to see the International Criminal Court focus its attention on a complicated case of this kind.
That's what we can hope, you know. All right, Professor, our next guest is Reserve Brigadier General Yossi Cooper-Wasser from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He last served as the Director General of the Israel Ministry of Strategic Affairs and was previously the Deputy Head of IDF Military Intelligence. Yossi wants to talk about why the Palestinian Authority pays a huge portion of its annual budget to subsidize terrorists and their families. He's actually published his own findings in a shocking report called Incentivizing Terrorism. Let's hear from him.
Professor Dershowitz, the Palestinian Authority is paying salaries to the Palestinians arrested in Israeli jails because they committed terror attacks, and also gives allocations to the families of what they term the martyrs, those people who lost their lives in the context of the struggle of the Palestinians against Zionism. This amounts to something like 1.1 billion shekels in 2016, which is the equal of $300 million every year. This is 7% of the budget and more than 20% of the international support they get from international donors. What do you think should be done in this respect, bearing in mind that the international community actually gives a blind eye to this phenomenon and keeps giving the Palestinians support in spite of the fact that they stick to this immoral and illegal activity that stands in contradiction to their commitments according to the Oslo Agreement? How can we change that? How can we make the Palestinians move in a different direction so that the way to peace will be open?
Well, first of all, Yossi Cooper-Wasser has contributed enormously to Israel and to our understanding of the rule of law and the fight against terrorism. And I think you make a very, very important point. Look, everybody who incentivizes or encourages terrorism is a criminal, is guilty of the crime of inciting murder. As you probably know, one of the very few areas in the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction which involves crimes that are, quote, inchoate crimes, are incitement to genocide. And what the Palestinian Authority is doing is inciting impressionable young men and women to go out and kill Jews and offering them bounties for doing it and money for doing it. Imagine the situation if the head of the mafia offered $100,000 or $10,000 to anybody who would go kill his rival, and then the rival is killed. Obviously, the head of the mafia would be brought to trial in any country, convicted and sentenced to the maximum sentence permissible for inciting the murders that resulted. And I do think that the leaders of the Palestinian Authority, even though some of them are people I know and I have met with, are guilty of crimes when they pay money to people who have engaged in terrorism and send a message to future terrorists that their family will be well taken care of. The options available to Israel are not easy ones. One of them would be obviously to charge people who are involved in the payment of ransom money or of blood money to killers, charge them with incitement to murder and bring them to trial. That would be very difficult. The international community would reject that because among the people who would be brought to trial, obviously, would be Mohammed Abbas and others who have been leaders of the Palestinian Authority. That's one option. The second option would be to bring a case in front of the International Criminal Court, because these people do fit in to the criteria of the International Criminal Court. They are systematically inciting the murder of Jews based on religion, ethnicity, and national origin. But I don't think Israel wants to be in the position where it brings cases involving the Palestinians to the International Criminal Court, except perhaps in response to a charge that might be brought against them. My own hope is that the International Criminal Court does not get into the area of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But if it does, Israel ought to bring charges against those leaders who have made statements incentivizing or made payments incentivizing terrorist murderers. So the options available to Israel are not easy ones. The best option, of course, is to keep publicizing this, as you, Yossi, and others have done, and to make sure that people around the world understand that Israel's, quote, partner for peace is in the business of inciting and encouraging the murder of innocent Jewish civilians in violation, obviously, of the Oslo Accords, in violation of international law, in violation of all morality. So at the very least, we have to make it clear to the world that Israel is dealing with a leadership that out of one side of its mouth says it wants peace and an independent state, but out of the other side of its mouth and out of the other side of its pocketbook, it is paying for murder and incentivizing murder and encouraging people to commit murder. That is murder. That is a crime. And the international community ought to understand that and recognize that and deal with those who pay money to terrorists and terrorist families, recognize them as the criminals that they are.
Thanks for your response, Professor. Our next guest is Yossi Abramowitz. Your paths first crossed when you defended him as a student activist at Boston University. Today, Yossi is still just as passionate as he was in his student days, but this time about a new cause. Let's take a look at what he's up to and then hear his question.
And today I'm proud to announce that Israel is coming back to Africa in a big way.
Power Africa, a strong and prosperous and self-reliant Africa.
From this mountaintop, we call on the United Nations to affirm that access to green power and affordable green power should be elevated as a fundamental human right for all of humanity and for all people.
Hi, Alan. Yossi Abramowitz. I wrote a chapter in your book, What Israel Means to Me. You wrote about my case, my precedent-setting free speech case of Abramowitz versus Boston University, my anti-apartheid banner in the 80s. And I'm an old Soviet Jewry activist. Today, I'm one of the founders of the solar industry here in Israel, as well as in Africa and other places. And so I wrestle with this question, and I'd love your feedback on it. What does it mean in the 21st century for Israel and the Jewish people to be a light unto the nations? And so obviously I have my solar piece, but I'm sure your vision would be far more expansive. And I have a feeling, just a hint, that Israel really is at the verge of being a superpower of goodness between our water, green energy, and agricultural technology. So that's my softball question for you. Thanks so much.
Yossi, thank you so much. Of course, I remember you well. You were a hero of both the Soviet Jewry and the free speech movement early on and back in the day. And it's so great to hear that you're continuing to do your important work. Look, Israel is a light unto the nations, and now it's becoming a light in a literal sense because it is providing energy, clean energy, solar energy. What Israel is doing is helping the world enormously. Look, Israel is not quite 69 years old. No country in the history of humanity, has contributed more to humanity in a shorter period of time than the nation state of the Jewish people, Israel. I just recently learned of a company that is producing water, drinkable water out of air. Imagine what that will do for countries that have little or no water. Imagine what Israel has already done for agriculture with its drip technology, what you're doing with your solar technology. Israel is providing so much assistance to so many parts of the world. Even countries that don't have formal relations with Israel benefit enormously. I was recently in Cuba, and I heard from Cubans that although Cuba doesn't have any diplomatic relations with Israel, even the Cuban leaders are very, very encouraged by what Israel is doing and appreciative of what Israel brings to the world. African countries as well, some of whom have to hide their close association. The Emirates, other countries are becoming more and more reliant on Israel's ability to provide clean energy and to provide for a lower carbon footprint and to do all the kinds of things that you're doing. Look, the Torah has so many things that are environmental in nature. When you come to a city, you don't knock down its fruit-bearing trees. The environment is an important part of our legacy as human beings in the world. The tradition in Judaism is that God only created part of the world, but with the help of human beings will complete the creation. And I think environmentalists take that seriously because we're the ones who are tasked to preserve the planet from those who care less or nothing about what we leave to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren in the future. So Yasher Koach, may you go from strength to strength in your work on environment, and may you always attach the label of Israel to everything you do. Israel must get credit for its contributions to the world because the world blames Israel so falsely on so many things it doesn't deserve to be blamed for. At least the world has to recognize the credit Israel rightfully deserves in helping to make this a better planet, a safer planet, a cleaner planet, and a planet that will endure much, much longer because of the work you do to preserve the environment. So may you go from strength to strength, Yossi.
Beautiful. All right, Professor, our next guest is someone who you've also known for many years. Joey Shabbat wants to ask about something which has been on his mind for quite some time. He's a lawyer, not a prophet, but he sent in a question suggesting a new approach to looking at the Arab-Israeli conflict. Let's hear from him.
Hi, Alan. It was great seeing you in person in Israel last week. I mean, you're still so energetic, so much great energy. And of course, it's fun as ever to work with you on something. I'm lucky that our firms are working together. I think I told you this. You were my inspiration for going to Harvard. I sat in on your class thinking about thinking. And what I want to talk to you about today is something that maybe was inspired by your imperative that we should always be thinking about thinking and not just taking everybody else's word for it. My question is like this, and this has been bothering me for a long time. In business, they tell us that in order to really get a decision made, a complicated decision, you have to have all the stakeholders around the table at the same time. And that way they can hear each other and discuss and really come to an outcome that's going to stick. What has been missing from the Israeli-Palestinian discussion has been, I think, the stakeholders all being there. Because no one's talking about, what do our immediate neighbors have at stake in this discussion? No one's talking about, if we meet with Abbas and the PA, but what about Gaza, which also affects Egypt? And what I'm wondering is, this idea that was proposed by John Bolton recently, although I've seen it discussed by others, where we take the real economies of Egypt and the real economies of Jordan and basically enable the Palestinians to survive post-closing of a deal with Israel by integrating them into those economies. That suggests that any future discussions need to be not just between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but also need to involve senior level people of Egypt and Jordan, and not just in order to encourage the parties to make a decision, but actually to participate in those discussions and to agree to take a role in the life of the parties after closing of a deal. What do you think about that?
Joey, great question. It's a pleasure working with you. We're working to achieve justice together in a number of matters, and I've worked with your law firm over the years, and I'm delighted that your law firm has a a great presence in Israel and does terrific work. Look, not only are you a great lawyer, you're a great prophet. You now know that the most recent meetings between Israel and the United States involved discussions of including the surrounding states and talking about a kind of regional peace. I think most of the focus there was probably on the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, but I think your focus on Jordan and implicitly on Egypt is very, very important. I think all of those countries have to be brought into the process and shown how they can benefit from a reasonable peace between Israel and the Palestinians. You talk about a kind of economic federation between Jordan and the Palestinians. That might work, but of course, Jordan is a tottering economy, and the Palestinians right now do not have a particularly strong economy, although have the great potential for an economy. I have even greater hope than that. I'm hoping that once there's a Palestinian state, a demilitarized Palestinian state established based on some of the previous offers from Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton and Ehud Olmert and some of the other ideas that are on the table about land swaps. I hope once there is a Palestinian state, there could be economic encounters with Israel as well. The Palestinian people are a very innovative people. They're a high-tech people in Ramallah who are working. I'd like to see ultimately a closer relationship between the economies of Israel and the economies of a Palestinian state, because the Palestinians could benefit enormously from Israel's super economy, unlike Jordan's not so super economy and Egypt's not so super economy. But in the end, for peace to really work, it has to be a regional peace. It has to involve the Egyptians, it has to involve the Jordanians, it has to involve the Emirates, it has to involve the Saudis, and ultimately, it has to involve the northern neighbors of Israel too. Lebanon, which has now been hijacked and captured and kidnapped by Hezbollah, much to the distress of many Lebanese people who are suffering enormously. I remember when Lebanon was a paradise to the north of Israel and a peaceful neighbor. Now 100,000 rockets are aimed from Lebanon at Israel, and Israel will have no choice but to neutralize those rockets if they were ever fired at Israel, and it will cause enormous civilian casualties in Lebanon, all of which will be the fault of Hezbollah. One hopes that eventually Syria and Israel can make peace. These are all obviously involved in efforts to bring about regional peace. And so I think you are a prophet. I think this has to be done. But let's start with the two major countries. We have to start with Israel and the Palestinians. And right now, the ball's in the Palestinians' court. The Israelis have offered with no preconditions. Benjamin Netanyahu repeated this again just the other day. No preconditions, not even a previous recognition by the Palestinian Authority of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. That may well be required before there's a final resolution, but it is not a prerequisite to sitting down and negotiating. So the ball is now in the Palestinian court. They must earn their right to statehood. They won't be given it on a silver platter. They won't have happened to the West Bank what happened to the Gaza when Israel unilaterally left and was greeted with thousands of rockets and tunnels. That won't happen. The Palestinians have to earn the right to statehood. And before they do that, they have to sit down with the Israelis and negotiate. Hopefully other countries can then be brought in, and there can be a multilateral peace with widespread recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people by all the countries in the region. And then the economic prosperity of Israel can be widely shared around the region. The technological advancements of Israel can be shared, and it's a win-win. Everybody will benefit from the peace dividend if we can only achieve it.
All right, Professor, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much for your time. I also want to thank all of our guests, Professor Asa Kasher, General Cooper Wasser, Yossi Abramowitz, and Joey Shabbat. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to ILTV.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week. Thanks, Professor Dershowitz.